Scottish rock in the 1970s and 80s was untouchable. Raw energy, boundary-pushing creativity, and world-class musicianship. Big Country, Simple Minds, Nazareth. These weren't just bands. They were trailblazers who left their mark on rock forever. If you're a real rock fan, this is a story you simply need to hear. Let's start with Nazareth. They were formed in 1968 in Dunfermline and quickly made a name for themselves with a heavy, bluesy rock sound. Their 1973 album, Razamanaz, produced by Deep Purple's Roger Glover, was a turning point. The album included tracks like Broken Down Angel and Bad Bad Boy, which cemented their reputation as one of Scotland's top rock bands. The follow-up, Loud and Proud, in 1973, gave them another major hit with their cover of Joni Mitchell's This Flight Tonight. Which showed their knack for interpreting songs in their own powerful way. But it was in 1975 and the album Hair of the Dog that really put them on the map internationally, thanks to the title track and now classic ballad Love Hurts. Love hurts, love scars. Nazareth continued releasing albums through the 70s and 80s, but like many classic rock bands, really struggled to adapt to changing tastes in music by the late 1980s. They're still active today, though with a different lineup, having gone through several changes since their heyday. The sensational Alex Harvey Band, Saab, were one of the most unique and underrated rock bands to come out of Scotland in the 70s. They had this wild mix of hard rock, glam and theatrics. Alex Harvey himself had a background in the Glasgow blues scene before forming Saab in 1972. The band's 73 album Next was where they really hit their stride. The Faith Healer is often cited as one of their finest moments, a slow-building, hypnotic track that showcased their eccentric sound. As NME said, there was nobody quite like Alex Harvey. His charisma was off the charts. And Next is a perfect example of this ability to mix absurdity with rock genius. Saab stood out for the theatrical performances. Harvey had a knack of storytelling in his lyrics, bringing cabaret-like element to rock. Albums like Framed in 72 and The Impossible Dream in 74 showed their versatility, mixing humour, social commentary, and really big riffs. Harvey left the band in 1976, and although they tried to carry on without him, it wasn't the same. And sadly, Alex passed away in 1982, but the band's legacy lives on, with many citing them as a key influence in the development of theatrical rock. The Guardian said of them, the sensational Alex Harvey Band were equal parts bizarre and brilliant. Harvey's legacy remains one of the great, what could have been stories in rock. I'll second that. Now, you probably know Simple Minds for their massive 80s hits like Don't You Forget About Me. But before that, they had a really very different sound. Formed in 1977 in Glasgow, they initially took inspiration from punk and krautrock. The debut album Life in a Day 1979 was very much in the post-punk vein with sharp angular guitars and a minimalist approach. But it was their later work that began moving towards the more progressive atmospheric sound that really would define them in the 1980s. Empires and Dance from 1980 was where things started to shift, with longer, moodier tracks like I Travel. Critics often compared this period to perhaps early Roxy Music and David Bowie's Berlin-era albums. Scotsman said of them, Simple Minds began as a band clearly influenced by art rock at the time, but with their sharp guitars and minimalist approach. The 1982 album New Gold Dream, 81, 82, 83, 84, solidified their move into a more atmospheric, expansive style. Rolling Stone said of New Gold Dream, while Simple Minds managed to create a sound that was both intimate and massive. It was an album that made them stadium ready. And by the mid-1980s, Simple Minds had gone fully into the arena rock territory, but those early albums are still worth a listen if you're more into perhaps progressive rock than mainstream hits. They're still active today, though, with a very different sound. Now, Big Country came together in 1981 and became known for their distinctive guitar sound, which many said had mimicked the bagpipe sound. The debut album, The Crossing, in 1983, featured some of the best-known tracks like In a Big Country and Fields of Fire.
In a big country, dreams stay with you like a lover's voice far from.
It had a unique Scottish identity, using guitars to create a sound that echoed traditional Scottish music. Melody Maker noted, "Well, Big Country succeeded in making a rock album that felt distinctly Scottish without being cliché. It was music with a sense of place." Now, while they were often compared to U2 in the early 80s, Big Country had a style really all of their own, and they blended folk influences with rock. The follow-up album, Steel Tongue, in 1984, was a more introspective record, dealing with themes of working class struggle, but it didn't achieve the same commercial success. The Times described Steel Town as an underrated gem. It may not have had the hits of The Crossing, but its emotional depth makes it one of Big Country's finest moments. Sadly, lead singer Stuart Adamson struggled with his personal demons and took his own life in 2001. Big Country has continued in various forms since then, but the early 80s is really where they made their mark. Stone the Crows were a blues rock band from Glasgow fronted by the powerful Maggie Bell. Forming in 1969 and active until 1973, their self-titled debut album was produced by Led Zeppelin's manager Peter Grant, which gave them some early credibility. Tracks like Raining in Your Heart showcased Bell's impressive vocal range, and the band's blues-influenced rock sound fitted in with the heavier rock acts of the time.
If it's raining in your heart, come on into mine.
Rolling Stone said, "Maggie Bell has a voice that can go toe-to-toe with Janis Joplin." The second album, Ode to John Law in 1970, took things further with more complex arrangements and a tighter band dynamic. The Guardian said of it, "Stone the Crows were on the verge of greatness. Their blend of blues and rock felt organic and really ahead of its time." Sadly, tragedy struck in 1972 when their guitarist Les Harvey was electrocuted on stage and sadly died. The band really never recovered from the loss, and they split the following year. Maggie Bell went on to have a solo career, but Stone the Crows remain a key band in the development of blues rock of the early 1970s. If you're into progressive music that leans heavily into folk and psychedelia, then the incredible String Band is worthy of your time. Formed in the mid-1960s, they became known for their eclectic, experimental sounds. By the late 60s and early 70s, they'd shifted into more prog territory, blending folk with avant-garde elements. Times described them as the band that made folk psychedelic. Albums like The Hangman's Beautiful Daughter in 1968 and Wee Tam and the Big Huge in 1968 also showed that they had a unique approach to songwriting. Critics have often praised their willingness to experiment, but the band's style was definitely an acquired taste. Classic Rock said of them, "It's not an album you casually listen to, it demands your attention. And in return, it reveals its magic in layers." They disbanded in 1974 after a series of less successful albums. Beggars Opera were one of those lesser-known gems in the progressive rock scene. Formed in Glasgow in 1969, they gained a small but devoted following with their debut album, Act 1, released in 1970. The band had a strong keyboard presence which set them apart from other rock bands of the time. Prog magazine wrote, "Beggars Opera had a sound that was undeniably progressive, but more accessible than many of the contemporaries." Waters of Change in 1971 is often considered their best work, with tracks like Time Machine showing off their prog credentials.
Life would be sublime if only were to rhyme to the melody within our fantasy.
Melody Maker said of the album, well, Beggar's Opera managed to walk the fine line between virtuosity and listenability. It continued through the 70s, but by the end of the decade, the band had started to lose steam and eventually disbanded. The band Heavy Petting formed in 1981 and leaned more, perhaps towards glam metal scene that was emerging around that time. Their debut album, Letting Loose, from 1983, was produced by Queen's Brian May, and this gave it some early buzz. Tracks like In and Out of Love showed off their hook-heavy sound.
She told me she loved me, wouldn't let me away.
But never quite reached the heights of contemporaries like Def Leppard. Kerrang said of them, a solid effort with big hooks and anthemic choruses, though it struggled to stand out in an already crowded scene. They did have some successes in the UK, but by the late 1980s, glam metal was on its way out, and Heavy Petting faded from view. They reformed in the 2010s, but their best work remains in the early 80s. Cadell Bell were more on the progressive side with a mix of funk, jazz and rock. Now, their self-titled album debuted in 1976, and it didn't make a huge impact at the time, but over the years, it's gained quite a bit of a cult following. The Scotsman wrote, Cadell Bell's music was sophisticated, almost too ahead for its time with the mainstream audiences in the mid-1970s. Fronted by Maggie Riley, who would later work with Mike Oldfield on hits like Moonlight Shadow, Cadell Bell had a smooth, sophisticated sound that set them apart from heavier bands on this list. It didn't last long, though, disbanding after just a few years. Still, their 1976 album is worth a listen if you're into more polished, jazz-influenced rock. These 9 bands then have represented a key part of Scotland's rock history, from Nazareth's raw power to the incredible string band's experimental folk. Each left a mark. Some went on to international fame, while others remained cult favourites, but they all played a significant role in shaping rock music as we know today.